Hello guys and welcome to my new video. I've tested every single healer spec in patch 11.1 in terms of PTO, in terms of trying out the new dungeons, and again, this is going to be my tier list. This is not going to be looking at what healer is going to become meta in Season 2, 100% guarantee. This is only week 1 and Blizzard is intending to do a lot more changes, a lot more testing, but right now this tier list is going to be based on changes that have been announced, how the healer felt when I was testing. We'll talk about the big major bugs or some of the issues, some of the good things, some of the bad things. Let's go and get started. And if you'd like to see this type of video every week or every second week based on things like the weekly state of healers or the big bugs or big tuning or big changes that is incoming and how that's going to impact the class or the spec, specifically in Mythic Plus content, because I am looking at dungeons primarily in this video. Let me know if you'd like to see something like that. Like and subscribe. Just a little bit info about how the testing was conducted. Now, there is Mythic Plus scaling introduced in the PTO patches. I was running plus 12 keys on every single healer and I made sure to complete it. Keep in mind, all of these or majority of these dungeon runs were done in pugs. I was testing multiple different hero builds for specs if it was applicable based on the changes that were announced for patch 11.1, and on top of that I tried out different gameplays. For example, Resto Druid has quite a few changes in terms of how they deal damage. I tried out those, and on top of that I tried to keep the gear somewhat uniform across the board. I know there is Mythic Plus scaling introduced, but I did use the same trinkets across the board for all healers to make testing more appropriate. The first healer on this list is going to be a Mistweaver Monk. Without any surprise, I think a lot of people already know the power of Mistweaver Monk, an easy S tier healer right now based on the changes that were announced and based on my testing in terms of how easy it was to heal as a Mistweaver Monk. It was almost like a little break, because comparing it to some other healers where I was struggling, I had to pay attention all the time, Mistweaver was a dream. Based on my week 1 testing, I honestly should place Mistweaver Monk in its own category because that's how powerful it felt, and majority of the changes for Mistweaver Monk were to do with the fact that they're trying to increase your effectiveness when facing smaller number of targets, which is honestly a great quality of life. And it also had some, let's say, unforeseen kind of changes, because right now if you're playing with Jade Bond and you're playing something like Red Crane, you can have an insane amount of uptime of Red Crane buff, and you can also reduce its cooldown significantly depending on how you play during those windows. This has led to a lot of people complaining about this because the uptime is really high. There's a lot of people don't think that this change is going to make it alive. I think Blizzard might have a look at it. They might have a look at the gameplay interaction. They might look at possibly changing this or tuning it down. But even if they do, I still feel like Mistweaver is in a really good spot. It is a joy to play. It provides an insane amount of healing. Again, I was playing Master of Harmony, so I was doing a lot of healing, a lot of damage. I do have multiple charges of Thunder Focus Tea, the interaction with Jade Empowerment, interaction with Crackling Jade Lightning. Very little mana concerns because you do have Mana Tea, and these keys felt like a joy to do. Keep in mind, one of the reasons why I want to place Mistweaver Monk in its own tier or head and shoulders above a lot of other healers is because a lot of other healers receive certain changes, or there are certain bugs that make them worse than their Season 1 counterparts. And Mistweaver Monk received some really nice changes, and they're doing some really good numbers, and other healers just feel worse. And this is why I think Mistweaver Monk deserves this slot right now based on my week 1 testing. We'll have to see if that's going to change in the future. Mistweaver Monk, an absolute god. Now, the next healers are not really that obvious. Honestly, I was thinking about where I should place it in the good category, and I'm going to be placing Preservation of Evoker here, and I don't know, because I've tested multiple different versions of Preservation of Evoker. I was playing Flameshaper. Flameshaper received the majority of changes, and I was testing my trusty old Chrono Warden. I do prefer Chrono Warden when it comes to that Mythic Plus content, because I just think it elevates an already existing toolkit that Preservation of Evoker has. Now, as I mentioned, I did try out Flameshaper, and majority of the Blizzard changes are to do with Flameshaper and trying to make it feel more appealing when it comes to that Mythic Plus content. Now, I do kind of gravitate towards Chrono Warden because I'm not all that familiar or haven't played Flameshaper all that much, and maybe with more testing my mind is going to change a bit more and I'll get used to Flameshaper a bit more. But based on Chrono Warden alone, I do enjoy Preservation of Evoker. There's also issues with the tier set bonus, because a lot of people were looking at the 4 set bonus and they were like, maybe I'll be able to echo the Verdant Embraces that I'm going to be casting, and that's going to also apply insurances. It doesn't work like that. You basically have to apply or use a Verdant Embrace on someone else to get those 2 hots if you really want to min-max it. But I know a lot of people are going to be reluctant about having to use Verdant Embrace on other people, putting yourself into possibly dangerous positions or maybe even dying. But guys, I want to know, do you think that the 4-set bonus for Preservation of Evoker is something that you would like or would like to see change? So it's bugs galore with Preservation of Evoker. Some are working for you, some are working against you. I don't even know where to place Preservation at this point. All I know is that based on my testing, it felt pretty good, and we'll have to see in the future. I do have to talk about the fact of the range limitations, and that's always existed, but I don't want to harp on about this. I do want to highlight the fact that a lot of people have been talking about the fact that Augmentation of Evoker might not be meta because it's no longer going to be buffing your tanks or healers. But you still have to look at the fact that the Ebon Might uptime for the Augmentation of Evokers in Season 2 is looking to be pretty high for multiple different reasons, so I'm still not sure if Augmentation is not going to be meta, so that's something that you need to keep your ear to the ground. More testing is needed. I'm going to be placing it in the good section for the time being and see how it feels in the next couple of weeks, and see maybe Blizzard is going to change that set to make it feel a lot more interesting to play. And the next healer is going to be a healer that I got so many questions about because the changes announced for patch 11.1 were somewhat convoluted or did not include a lot of information. That's going to be Restoration Druid. Now, Resto Druid is going to be firmly placed in wrong tuning. I agree with a lot of the design philosophies that Blizzard is trying to do in terms of, hey, they want to make mastery or change mastery in terms of how it feels when you only have a couple of hots on people. They want to make it more impactful. For example, someone takes unexpected damage and you only need to have a couple of hots on them in order to start to feel the true power of mastery. And this is also very relevant in raiding content where you might not have that many hots on them. But the implementation of this change on the PTR servers, because now we know the values, is kind of abysmal, and I'm sure the Blizzard did not intend this, because right now you only get a marginal gain if you only have a couple of hots on people. And then after that, if you have a bunch of hots on people, you're getting a pretty noticeable decrease compared to your old mastery. And this basically kind of means that you're being punished if you're someone who likes to pre-apply hots before there's going to be a lot of damage happening, which basically how Resto Druid plays. You're kind of being punished for this with the current tuning of mastery, which again, this is clearly not what Blizzard intended. They just got the tuning wrong, or at least that's what I'm hoping. On top of that, Blizzard wants to simplify the way the Resto Druids deal damage. You can see the blue post right here where it says utilizing either their damaging physical abilities or magic spells instead of weaving between them both in order to reduce their damage rotation complexity. I'm not sure what the best DPS rotation or the best kind of, let's say, hero build is going to be. I'm just hoping that the again, tuning is going to be correct, that you're going to be rewarded for the effort that you put in. But when you look at charts like these, which indicate Season 1 Mythic plus Healer DPS using real play information, you could say that Resto Druid could do good damage when they're allowed to. You saw that in MDI and things like that, but in real scenarios, in pug content, in doing dungeons where people are taking a lot of damage, Resto Druid damage is something that needs to be addressed, and I think Blizzard is trying to simplify it, but they also need to make sure they get the tuning right. But overall, I think Resto Druid being placed in the wrong tuning section is the right way to go, because the mastery changes need to be looked at. The DPS changes, again, I still think they need to be looked at a little bit further. I do think that the class tree is an improvement, but I still feel there are certain talent nodes that should be borderline baseline or made easier to acquire. For example, Fluid Form. Let me know how I feel about this. Let's move on to the next healer. And now let's move on to the next healer, and that's going to be Holy Priest. Now, in the initial video, I placed Holy Priest quite high based on the design idea. I wasn't looking at tuning, and that wasn't the intent of the video, but now, based on trying out Holy Priest, trying it out in Mythic Plus content, trying out different builds, I actually do believe there's a bit of that wild west for Holy Priest right now. There's a lot of builds that exist, for example, in raiding that can be somewhat questionable in terms of the gameplay, but I'm going to be placing Holy Priest in wrong tuning right now. All you have to do is try and read through the patch notes, and you'll know that the big design idea from Blizzard was to make Holy Priest Prayer of Healing feel more impactful, and I don't think they really achieved that right now, but that can absolutely change the next coming weeks, because I think a lot of Holy Priests specifically are just kind of bored of that Light Weaver single target heal into single target heal gameplay, and they want to have more options. So I'm waiting, or I'm hoping for more changes to happen in order to make Prayer of Healing feel more impactful. I did try out a bunch of different builds in terms of Apotheosis uptime, because you have to remember Apotheosis is tied into your 4-set bonus as well, so I think there is a lot of interaction to be had. There's a lot of experimentation to be had It's a bit of that wild, wild west situation happening. I tried out a bunch of different builds. I had a decent amount of success, but none of this really matters because there is a relatively big bug with Trail of Light. Trail of Light seems to heal more targets than intended. It was my top heal at the end of the dungeon. That is clearly not intended. Trail of Light is broken. It's making Holy Priests feel a lot stronger than they should be, so it is very hard to judge in terms of where Holy Priests should be placed in this kind of ranking. I think wrong tuning is the best way to put it. I think they need to look at Prayer of Healing a little bit more. I think they need to fix some of the bugs, and then we'll test Holy Priest again. But I like the design intentions, but the execution is to be questioned. And now let's move on to the next healers, and in terms of needs more changes, and maybe you're confused about what is the difference between the two of them. Wrong tuning basically means that I like the design choice that Blizzard is trying to do. It's just that tuning is wrong or tuning is bad. And in terms of needs more changes, I'm not a huge fan where Blizzard is taking the spec, and I think they need more impactful things to make the gameplay more interesting or the spec more interesting. And we're going to be looking at Resto Shaman, and we're going to be placing it in needs more changes. Now, Blizzard is trying to simplify or reduce the keybinds that Resto Shaman has, but I feel like how they did it is a little bit weird. It did remove AG in terms of Ancestral Guidance, but it didn't really compensate for that. But that's not a big deal because you still have a lot of time left, and Blizzard is most likely going to change something more, I believe. Outside of that, they did try to bake in some of your abilities in terms of reducing the keybind space, in terms of Mana Tide Totem being baked into Healing Tide Totem, and there's a couple of others. They tried to make a couple of talents that people don't pick and make them more impactful, but they did remove, let's say for example, if you're looking at your spec tree as Resto Shaman, they did remove Healing Wave, and that is going to become baseline at level 11, and you're like, okay, I get to mess around with a talent point, but they made AV, Ancestral Vigor, 2 talent points instead of 1. You're looking at some quality of life improvements, some new talents being introduced, but you're also looking at the fact that if you want to provide additional utility as Resto Shaman and have the full power of Ancestral Vigor, you have to put 2 points into it. You're looking at quality of life talents like Terrazane's Resilience, which gives you permanent Earth Shield and Water Shield. You don't have to reapply it. It's not going to drop stacks. It's actually broken on PTO right now. And then you look at the tier set bonus, and I was running Totemic Resto Shaman, and I think the tier set bonus, the insurance healing, was actually pretty decent when you compare it to a lot of other healers. But if you look at Farseer interaction with the 4 set bonus, it does work with Healing Rain, and there's quite a few popular Farseer builds right now who don't really place a high priority on Healing Rain. So I think Blizzard actually needs to have a further look at Farseer, specifically at Healing Rain and the interaction of Healing Rain. Does it feel good to press? And they need to do something. They need to address it a bit more. I personally would like to see more Farseer changes. I personally would like Farseer to become more impactful when it comes to all forms of content as Resto Shaman, because I just think it's more fun to play than Totemic. And I would also feel bad if I did not mention Mana. Now, as Totemic Resto Shaman, if you're running on live servers, there has been things to make or reduce the mana cost of Surging Totem, so Mana is not that, it's not all that bad. But running Resto Shaman Totemic in these Mythicless dungeons, Mana was an issue. I did have to drink a lot more than other classes out there, specifically because you don't have your old tier set anymore. I also have to think in the future and see how Mana is gonna be like when people are not wearing that Sicker necklace that gives you some mana back. Playing Totemic Resto Shaman on PTR servers in this Mythicless dungeon, I had to drink substantially more than a lot of other healing classes, and I'm quite frankly sick of it. I really am sick of it. So we'll see if Blizzard is going to add or address some of these issues. At the end of the day, the sky is not falling. This is week 1 of PTR testing. There's plenty more weeks to go, and I'm hoping Blizzard is going to get it right. And now the next seal is going to be Discipline Priest. And initially I was unsure about the changes. I needed to test them out. I needed to see them in action. And again, this is only week 1 of PTR. There's going to be more changes to try and fix things, but I'm going to be placing Discipline Priest in needs more changes because I'm not sold on the design philosophy right now. I really don't like the fact that they removed Rapture, because I really did think it helped Discipline Priest. Again, I'm mainly running Mythic Plus content. It helped Discipline Priest in that spot healing, and that it's something that I actually missed when running these Mythic Plus keys. Blizzard specifically mentioned they wanted to reduce the number of cooldowns that Discipline Priest has, so they removed Rapture. But they also made it easier to acquire cooldowns like Evangelism and Ultimate Penitence, so you could arguably have 2 new cooldowns instead of 1, again depending on the tuning, depending on the talent build you're running. On top of that, one of the biggest talking points was to do with CDO or cooldown reduction, because it did change Void Summon. It no longer has Smite included, and this is something that people were talking about in Season 1 about how Smite was at high haste values because the more smites you would cast, the more cooldown reduction you would get. I am probably one of the few people, I'm not sure, maybe I am one of the few people, maybe that is a majority thinking, but I didn't mind Season 1 Mythic Plus gameplay for the Discipline Priest. It's something that I actually played a lot. I like that CDR gameplay, I like how much CDR you can get, especially during Bloodlust or Heroism when spamming smites and things like that. I'm not completely opposed to that, but I can see why there would be people who might not enjoy this really high pressure type of gameplay. So they removed Smite from Void Summoner, but you still have things like Mind Blast and Penance in there, and their CDR values have been increased. And when you have these abilities available, you're pushed into using them as much as possible because you want to optimize your CDR, and it kind of creates, again, a rigid gameplay. I'm not sold about these changes so far for Discipline Priest. I think some of these changes actually go against what they actually initially wanted to do. I think Blizzard has to really decide about the future of the Discipline Priest. Do they want them to go towards that CDR gameplay or away from that CDR gameplay? Do they want them to have multiple cooldowns? Do they want them to have a better way of spot healing or filling in the losses of Rapture? I don't know. And the last healer on this list is going to be Holy Paladin, and I'm going to be placing Holy Paladin in this questionable tier because I don't really agree with the changes they announced. I tested Holy Paladin in multiple dungeons because honestly Holy Paladin is the only healer that I haven't really properly geared in the War Within. The last time I properly played this was in the War Within beta. So because of this, I was running multiple dungeons with Holy Paladin because I was feeling rusty. I wasn't really used to Holy Paladin gameplay because it's been a long time. I was running Lightsmith, I was running Herald of the Sun. In terms of the changes that are happening in 11.1, they are nerfing your most viable or optimal build when it comes to Lightsmith AC. They are nerfing that, but I still think it was usable and I still had decent numbers with it. And in terms of some of the compensation buffs, they did increase the value of some of your hard casting abilities in terms of Holy Light and Flashlight, depending on how you use it, depending on your talent build. And if you watch a lot of my videos, you're probably fully aware that I'm not a huge fan of hard casting as Holy Paladin. I do think it's a melee healer, and the peak gameplay for me was when you would rely a lot on your instant cast abilities. And based on my testing, again, it's been a long time since I played my Holy Paladin, and I know a lot of people were talking about the fact how reliant they are on their cooldowns in terms of wings, and oh boy, people were really not over exaggerating the reliance on wings as a Holy Paladin regardless of which build you're running. And it felt a little bit rough at times because you have to remember, Holy Paladin when it comes to Mythic Plus content is not the best healer. It's not like an overpowered healer, and technically they're basically nerfing your best build. And on top of that, Blizzard wants you to hardcast your abilities a little bit more, but casting things like Holy Light, which has a relatively slow casting speed, costs so much mana, doesn't feel all that great. I know you can have talents like Divine Favor and things like that, but honestly, I think Blizzard is really confused about the identity of Holy Paladin. What type of healer do they want Holy Paladin to be? And I know why they're having such a hard time, because Holy Paladin's output in something like raid environments is actually pretty good when you look at Season 1 and things like that. Holy Paladin is a sought after healer when it comes to raiding based on the logs that you can see in Season 1. He can provide raid-wide damage reduction, he can provide good healing, he can provide good damage, and a lot of raiding rosters would like to have Holy Paladin in their midst. But I don't think that really translates for Holy Paladins when it comes to that Mythic Plus content, and in order for them to feel better in those dungeons, Blizzard would need to add buffs, and I think Blizzard is extremely scared about buffing them in Mythic Plus, which is going to translate into an overperformance in raiding content. It's almost like the opposite when you compare it to something like Resto Druids, where Resto Druids historically have been stronger in Mythic Plus and weaker in raid when it comes to that really high-end content, and Blizzard is trying to find the balance. So at the end of the day, there is a big question marks about how Blizzard is going to tune Holy Paladin. Are they going to focus on their performance in raid, their performance on Mythic Plus? And now for the summary of the video. While I was editing this, Blizzard has announced some class changes for week 2, and there's been some substantial changes for certain healers, and honestly, I cannot test these because the PTR server is down, so I'm going to be changing the ranks for some of these based on what I see so far. So keep in mind, everything that you watched before, it's aimed at week 1, and some of it is relevant still, but we're going to be changing this based on my perception of what Blizzard is assuming to do in week 2. We're not going to look through all of the changes, but for Mistweaver Monk, they're basically reworking Jade Bond, and if you watch the Mistweaver section, you're fully aware that Jade Bond was kind of, the cooldown reduction is kind of insane, so they're changing that and removing the cooldown reduction. By removing the cooldown reduction, they're actually lowering Red Crane and Yulon's base cooldown to 2 minutes from 3. And you can see the intention here is we're reducing the baseline cooldown of both Celestials to account for the loss of dynamic cooldown reduction. And besides that, Chikaku now applies Enveloping Mist for 4 seconds when they expire or are consumed, and Chi's Gust of Mist healing is increased by 40%, used to be 20, and Yulon's Soothing Breath healing is increased by 500%. I actually think this compromise is not bad at all. We'll have to see at the numbers. We'll have to see when we're testing this. In terms of other changes, you'll see that Chikakun's Absorb amount now scales with the cooldown of your Celestial. Jade Empowerment now increases Crackling Jade Lightning damage by 3000% instead of 2000%, and cleaves at 10% effectiveness, used to be 25%. Honestly, I really want to see how that's going to feel in Mythic Plus Dungeon again. Can't wait to try it out. Lotus Infusion increases healing taken by 10% instead of 8%. Yulon's Whisper healing has been increased. Conduit of the Celestial Conduit damage has been increased. If we go back to the tier list in terms of is Mistweaver going to change based on my perception in terms of what's happening in week 2, no, I still feel Mistweaver is going to be sitting in that S tier position, and I cannot wait to test out the changes because I do think that the Mistweaver dev is cooking. In terms of Druid, there's not a whole lot. If you look at the Druid general changes, Moonkin form has been added to the class tree in Sunfire's previous position. Developers note here is that restoring Moonkin form to the class talent tree empowers Restoration Druids to use Convoke their spirits for magic damage. So this was kind of basically looking at the whole overall rationale about damage. We talked about that in Resto Druid section in terms of you can choose whether you want to go physical or magic. But if you went magic, you didn't really have the Convoke options, and they're basically trying to fix that. And again, outside of that, in terms of Resto Druid changes, Restoration Druids now learn Improved Nature's Cure in the class talent tree upon reaching level 10. Not a huge amount of changes here. In terms of my tier list, am I going to change it? No. Right now, I'm going to keep it here because I don't know if they fixed the mastery scaling. I'm not sure because I'm not able to go on the PTR servers. As long as they fix the mastery scaling, I think Resto Druid could potentially move up in the list, but right now we have to wait and see. And in terms of Evoker, there's quite a few changes for Flame Shaper. You can see they're reverting some of the changes. Again, honestly, I would need to try this out on the PTR. I would need to run a couple of dungeons to see how it feels, because my initial ranking for Preservation Evoker is based on my time with Chrono Warden, and I enjoyed my time with Chrono Warden. I'm not going to change this. I'm going to try out Flame Shaper a bit more. There's quite a few bugs, as I mentioned, with Preservation. There's issues with Dream Breath. I'm quite surprised they're not really addressing the 4-set bonus, which I think should be addressed as soon as possible, but I'm still gonna keep Preservation Evoker here because this is based on my Chrono Warden experience. In terms of priest changes, there's a severe lack of priest changes, which is kind of worrying in my opinion. Aegis of Wrath has been renamed to Eternal Barrier and has been updated, no longer decays over time, and instead increases the duration of power or shield by 5 seconds, and its absorption by 20, used to be 30, no longer reduced in PvP combat now. I'm gonna keep Discipline here because I still think they should address some of the issues that I mentioned in the Discipline Priest section. You can go and check it out. And in terms of Holy Priest, there is no changes for Holy Priest, which is extremely weird because there is substantial bugs with Trail of Light. There is also substantial tuning issues with something like Prayer of Healing, and I feel like they should definitely be addressed right now, but maybe Blizzard is cooking up something big in the next week's update. So the Priest is not really changing because there's just lack of changes overall. Now, in terms of Restoration Shaman, there's been quite a few buffs, and again, they're not really all that inspiring because they're mainly aura buffs, but all healing has been increased by 5%, and you can see it here. The baseline healing adjustment is aimed at keeping Resto Shaman's overall throughput similar to their levels before Ancestral Guidance was removed. So one of the biggest complaints that people had was that AG was removed, but it didn't really compensate for that. And again, I think they're throwing numbers out there in terms of 5%, and if they feel like it's not enough, they might adjust it later on. I think the intention here is that they do want to compensate for the fact that AG is removed, which I think is good. Acid Rain damage is increased by 25%. Again, there were nerfs to Acid Rain in Season 1 because Blizzard it's kind of like a shock response to the fact that Resto Shamans were OP at the start of Season 1 and they were just like throwing numbers again. Again, Acid Rain damage increase is also nice, and they fixed the issue with Terrorism and Resilience. I talked about this already. You couldn't really play this. Overall, I have no idea where to place Resto Shaman right now because I do think the intention here is nice. They're trying to compensate for the AG removal. They're buffing your damage. But at the same time, I also would like to see more changes to do with something like Farseer. I personally would like Farseer to be the way to go in Season 2, but that's only my personal opinion. I also think the fact that AV Ancestral Vigor requires 2 talent points, I don't think it's needed. I think it would actually be really fun to try and play around with other talent builds that are available. I also think that some of the new talent being introduced needs some further iteration and tuning. So where do I place Resto Shaman? I think it's leaning towards that good section because I do like these changes. I think Blizzard is acknowledging some of the things that they did, some of the things that they removed, and they're trying to fix or compensate for those. But at the same time, I still would like to see further iterations. So I am really lost about this here. Do I place Resto Shaman in good, or do I keep it here? Let me know, because I'm going to be very cautious, place it here with the hopes of further changes, specifically to Fireseer, and we'll have to see. And some of the most interesting changes have to do with Holy Paladin. Commanding Light now increases the healing transfer of Beacon of Light by 5% instead of 10%. They're nerfing Beacon. They're nerfing Truth Prevails. They're nerfing Greater Judgment. These are to do with your Judgment usage. But they're buffing Holy Prism. They're buffing Holy Shock damage by a whopping 100%. They're buffing Holy Shock healing by 40%. They're buffing Light of Dawn healing by 15%. There is no buffs to Word of Glory, which I think is a little bit, again, it depends. But outside of that, Holy Light healing has been increased by 20% and now costs 7% base mana. So more cost to your Holy Light, which is already quite expensive, but it's going to heal for more. But they're kind of nerfing Divine Favor. So Divine Favor now increases healing done by Holy Light or Flash of Light by up to 20% instead of 40%. So overall, I think the fact that they're buffing Holy Shock is really, really nice. About time, especially considering the fact that in Season 2, your 4-set bonus revolves around Divine Toll, and Divine Toll and Holy Shock is a really nice interaction. I genuinely think these are nice changes, outside the fact that I'm not really sold on the Holy Light. They're pushing Holy Light onto Holy Paladins. It is still a relatively long cast. It still costs a lot of mana. It's not something that you can spam. Again, I'm not really sold on the whole Holy Light kind of agenda here, so I'm going to be changing the tier list for this. I think overall these are nice changes. The buffs to Holy Shock, I think, is something that people are going to really enjoy. I personally am not a huge fan of the hard casting agenda here in terms of Holy Light. Maybe they should reduce the cast time of Holy Light. Maybe Infusion of Light should work in terms of reducing the cast time of Holy Light or something along those lines, because in the modern World of Warcraft game, the cast time of Holy Light just feels too long. So I'm going to be placing Holy Paladin somewhere here. I think these changes overall are good, but they're not, again, Holy Paladin is not finished, is not perfect healer, at least in my opinion. There could be more changes in the future, but overall, it is climbing, and I think it might climb in the future as well. Let me know how I feel about this tier list. And again, this tier list is not based on meta or anything like that. And this section specifically is looking at week 2 changes that have not been tested yet. Which healer are you most excited for? And if you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next guide.